Hello guys, it's Odie here with a new guide regarding the Mara 6 set. In this video I'll be going over gearing, specs, and I'll try to cover most of the frequently asked questions I've been seeing come up since 2.05. If you're interested in more written information, you should head over to the US or EU forums and read Vocaloid 9's thread, which is very informative and is a compilation of most of the testing he and other people have been doing since the patch. I will be providing links in the description to two of the most relevant threads discussing this topic. I've ran some of the testing myself as well, however, as you probably can imagine, with no training in the game and being reliant on RNG as a main source of getting your items, I wasn't able to test everything myself. As most of you probably know, 2.05 has changed the way 6 set works and how your sentries will scale with your items, making it competitive at high end, and more on that later. First, let's discuss the set and the problems it has and what skills actually work with it. Let's call this frequently asked questions without the questions being asked, but answers provided instead. Most of them are courtesy of Vocaloid 9, by the way. Multi-shot, impale, cluster arrow, chakram, and elemental arrow are the only hatred spenders sentries work with when using 6-piece. Increased damage to hatred spender on gear increases damage on sentry's hatred spender on 6-piece. This simply means that if you have % multi-shot damage on your head and multi-shot on your bars, the multi-shot the sentries will be firing will get increased damage from that skill modifier. Increased damage to sentry on gear increases damage on sentry's hatred spender on 6-piece. This means if you have % sentry damage on your shoulders or chest or quiver, it will increase all the damage of your sentry, including the damage of the hatred spenders they'll be using, depending on which ones you chose on your skill bar. Damage increased to elemental skill increases damage on sentry's hatred spender if hatred spender element is the same element being buffed. This means if you're using physical gear, for example, and you have cluster arrow with shooting stars, which is physical, multi-shot with broadfire, which is physical, even though Spitfire sentry element says it's fire, the two hatred spenders I mentioned that will be fired by a sentry will still receive full physical damage buff. The sentry's normal attack, bolt, and missiles will be fire and won't benefit from your physical %. Each hatred spender has their own cooldown and is activated in a specific order, depending on a hatred cost. Sentry fires at a fixed ratio between the bolts and the hatred spender, which is based on attack speed that is dynamically updated. It does not snapshot. If hatred spender has a CC effect, it also gives the same CC effect on your sentry's hatred spender. For example, cluster arrow with dazzling arrow. The sentries will be stunning mobs in this case. Also, an interesting subject most people are asking about is what skills exactly augment the sentries. What basically works here is ambush, singled out, ballistics, steady aim, archery, and sharpshooter. What doesn't work, on the other hand, is Call the Weak and Thrill the Hunt. This also doesn't work with focus and restraint set at all. And as a last mention, I will talk about what skills you don't want to use in combination if you don't want the 1 APS glitch. Basically anything with elemental arrow or chakram, anything with impale and multi-shot at the same time. Best current combination of skills to use together is pretty much multi-shot plus cluster arrow. On to gearing then. In every setup you'll be looking at 5 parts of Mara plus Ring of Royal Grandeur. The other items will depend on your personal playstyle and what's available to you. By playstyle, I'll simply mean what you will want to be more focused on, be it doing more damage yourself as a supplement to the sentries, or simply running around while they do the job. Whether you'll be going physical, fire, or maybe even lightning if you want to focus on utility instead of more damage, you'll want these items with the additional variations I'll mention at the end. Mara head, shoulders, chest, pants, and boots. You'll want sentry damage on shoulders, chest, as well as your main spender damage on head and boots. Harrington's belt or witching hour depending on your personal preference and party members. Amulet, bracers. I recommend Reaper's wraps here. Sword Jordan with the respective element of your choosing depending on what spenders you have in your bars, be it fire, lightning, or physical. Ring of Royal Grandeur and Tasker and Theo for gloves. Small mention here, for jewelry you'll want mainly to focus on elemental damage, dexterity, crit chance, and crit damage. As for weapons, you have 2 choices. As far as personal testing goes, the first setup would be the best, easiest to get and less reliant on RNG. Second one being more party oriented and based on luck. A 2-handed crossbow with highest possible average damage, dexterity, damage modifier, and socket. Some people only tend to look at DPS most of the time and forget the advantages of having a 2-hander. especially in this case considering most of your damage will be coming from sentries, who will shoot in almost fixed cycles, so you want them to be hitting as hard as possible at a consistent rate. Bows and one-handed crossbows, while they can have high DPS, their minimum weapon damage is almost half of the maximum, giving you a wide range of attacks, which basically means your sentries will be hitting half as hard most of the time. In your offhand, you'll be using a Bombardier's Rucksack with % sentry damage, if available or possible to reroll into. As for the second choice, Calamity plus Hell Trapper. Calamity for obvious reasons, it's basically marked for death, especially in a party. Hell Trapper can be fun, but it's too RNG dependent, however, is the only other choice you can make since in this setup using Net Slayer won't give you any advantages. Can't have any other Nats piece on due to dropping more important items otherwise. Another downside of this is you can't really use the Bombardier's Rucksack, meaning you lose the ability to drop 2 additional sentries as well as skill damage increase. That isn't too bad, however, on Trash since it dies quite fast anyway, but in some cases it might be detrimental on elite packs or rift bosses and even really packed areas in which you could be dropping multiple sentries while mobs crawl towards you. Multi-shot has quite a big aggro range, by the way. About bows, I don't consider this a viable choice at all since the extra attack speed from them won't really make up for the loss in damage ranges compared to a two-handed crossbow. Critter Shot will also make you run into the glitch I was talking about earlier since you will want to use Elemental Arrow with it. Now, let's discuss the other options. Hexing Pants of Mr. Yan. If you're into running around and letting your sentries do all the work for you, then this pair of pants is perfect for you. You'll have to drop Tesker and Theo for this and use the Mara Gloves. If fire, you might consider the Cinder Coat instead of Tesker and Theo and use Mara Gloves, which would give you the option of using Cluster Arrow as your main spender because of resource cost reduction, allowing you to do more personal damage yourself instead of multi-shot. Augil's Shoulders and Bracers. For this you'll have to use Mara Gloves and drop Reaper's Wraps. You'll get more toughness against elites as well as trash in general, as well as elite damage, 15%. Downsides being less hatred regen and the extra multi-shot in your sentry cycle being lost. As a last option we have Cloak of Garwolf. I don't consider this a good trade-off at all for dropping Tesker and Theo, but again depending on what you have you could use this instead, paired with the Mara Gloves until you find the rest of the items. On to the builds then. Keep in mind these are more of a baseline of what you'll be using in Torment 6. Feel free to switch around Smokescreen if you're doing lower Torment and feel you don't need it, and also passives depending on what you'll want to focus on most, be it damage, movement speed, or defense. The following skills will be used in all combinations, except different runes on some depending on what type of elemental damage you're stacking. Smokescreen with Healing Vapors as your number 1 defensive skill. On Sentry, if you want to go offensive, then Spitfire Sentry. As mentioned at the beginning of the video, the fact that the Sentry itself is fire, the only fire damage it will be doing is its normal bolt and missile attack. The rest will depend on what type of elemental damage rune you chose for your other spenders. In my case, that will be physical, with Cluster Arrow shooting stars and multi-shot full broadside. If you rather go defensive, you can choose Guardian Sentry instead, also quite well if your party is having issue dealing with higher torments. Sadly, they don't stack anymore, so it's better to spread them out to cover as much area as possible with the damage reduction from the bubble. Then we have Companion with Wolf, which will net you all the other companions due to the Mara Foresight bonus. In the 4th skill slot, I'm using Cluster Arrow, depending on what element you're stacking again. For physical, you'll want Shooting Stars, for fire loaded for Bear, and lightning, Dazzling Arrow. And yes, with this rune your sentries will be stunning enemies as previously discussed. As a generator, you'll want Hungering Arrow with either Spray of Teeth, which is physical, Serrated Arrow, which is fire, or Shatter Shot if you're lightning. If you want more utility and rather slow mobs instead, you can use Entangling Shot with Bounty Hunter as physical, Justice is served as fire, or Shock Collar as lightning. These all work best with the Buriza because of the extra pierces. This is just a side note, by the way. Your main spender, Multi-Shot with full broadside if physical, Arsenal if fire, or Fire at Will if lightning. Now, as a small side note, depending on your build, I personally find it more useful to use multi-shot as a spender if you're physical or lightning. If however you're fire and want to trade off the extra multi-shot and use a Cinder Coat with Mara Gloves instead of Tesker and Theo, you might use Cluster Arrow instead since the resource cost reduction should be more than enough to offset the high cost. Don't forget about your skill % damage increase on head and boots depending on what you'll be using as your main spender. Onto the passives then. If you want to go full offensive, you can use Blood Vengeance, Steady Aim, Ballistics, This is only for physical and fire though, and archery, or ambush if you have enough damage to one-shot trash. As defensive passives, you can use Awareness, Perfectionist, and last but not least, Numbing Traps. The latter is a really good passive which will allow your Sentry's attacks to debuff mobs, making them deal 25% less damage to everyone, quite useful in a party and even solo if you're having trouble staying alive. As for Paragon points allocation, I will mention the stats from highest importance to lowest, depending on the respective trees. In the core tree, you want movement speed to reach 25%, depending on what other items you have on you with this stat. Don't forget, Mara Forset bonus gives you an additional 10% just for having the ferrets out. Then you want all the other points put into dexterity unless you have problems surviving, in which case you might consider some vitality instead. In offense, you want crit chance, crit damage, and cooldown reduction. In defense, all resist, percent life, and armor. In the utility tree, you want resource cost reduction, area damage, and life on hit. Well, thanks for watching guys, and hopefully this guide was helpful to most of you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and even come watch me stream if you're interested. See you next time!